The opening shock was not a single missile launch or a single warship leaving port. It was the sudden overlap of three layers at once. A carrier force able to launch 70-plus aircraft with more than 5,000 personnel aboard, cruisers built around missile batteries measured in 122 vertical launch cells, and a strait only 21 miles wide at its narrowest, carrying roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. When Iran told the United Nations and the International Maritime Organization that only non-hostile vessels could pass if they coordinated with Iranian authorities, the message was blunt. Hormuz was no longer just a shipping lane, but a controlled fire zone, where naval presence, political alignment, and commercial survival were being fused into one dangerous equation. That is why a U.S. deployment built around carriers, cruisers, destroyers, marines, and stealth aircraft would change the picture faster than another round of diplomatic statements. The Associated Press reported that Washington was already moving at least 1,000 troops from the 82nd Airborne Division, while Reuters reported 2,500 Marines and sailors tied to the USS Boxer deployment and a wider regional force of about 50,000 USS military personnel. Taken together, that is not the profile of symbolic reassurance, but of a force preparing to protect sea lanes, absorb retaliation, and still hold enough reach to strike deep with aircraft like the F-35s and missiles like the Tomahawk. As Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put it, U.S. objectives included dismantling Iran's missile launch capabilities and degrading its navy and defense industry. What made the next layer of the crisis so dangerous was the geometry. Commercial traffic that normally moved through two shipping lanes only 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer, was now trying to survive under conditions where the U.K. Maritime Trade Operations Center had raised the threat level across the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman to critical, while daily vessel flow reportedly collapsed from about 138 transits to just 3. That kind of compression does not just slow traffic, it turns every tanker, container ship, and escort vessel into a predictable target track inside a corridor, too narrow for panic maneuvers and too busy for clean military separation. That is where the carrier screen starts to matter in practical terms. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser can carry 122 vertical launch cells. A Nimitz-class carrier can operate with more than 70 aircraft and about 5,000 personnel, and the F-35C was designed for contested airspace with stealth, sensor fusion, and longer reach than older carrier fighters. Put those numbers together, and the mission becomes clear. Hold open a corridor only 21 miles across, detect missile or drone launches early, and build enough layered defense that a single swarm does not freeze hundreds of miles of shipping behind it. As Naval Aviation News wrote, the F-35C brings true multi-mission power projection capability from the sea, which is exactly the kind of reach Washington would need if convoy escorts, tanker protection, and suppression of coastal launch sites all had to happen at the same time. The first real collision point was not the carrier itself, but the weapons Iran could launch before a U.S. jet ever crossed the coast. USNI News reported that Tehran had chosen to use projectiles to control the Strait of Hormuz, a method that lets it harass, delay, or selectively threaten shipping without shutting the lane with a minefield on day one. That matters because Iran's anti-ship inventory is built for exactly this kind of pressure. CSIS notes that systems such as Noor and Qadr sit in the roughly 120 to 300 kilometer class, while Khalij-Fars is an anti-ship ballistic missile associated with a range of about 300 kilometers, enough to put a narrow corridor and ships near its approaches under constant threat if launchers survive long enough to keep firing. That is why the American response had to be layered instead of dramatic. UKMTO warned that the aerial threat from missiles and drones remained elevated, that collateral damage risk stayed high, and that merchant vessels of all flags were at risk, which means a carrier screen cannot focus only on one missile track or one radar return when drones, fast boats, and coastal batteries may all be active inside the same battle space. A cruiser with 122 vertical launch cells, carrier fighters like the F-35C and F, A-18E, F, and destroyers working outer picket positions can widen the defended bubble But they still have to protect ships moving through lanes only 2 miles wide in each direction. If even one successful strike disables a tanker in that traffic pattern, the tactical hit turns into a shipping jam, then an energy shock, and then a political crisis stretching far beyond the Gulf. The next pressure point was endurance. A carrier group can project force fast, but holding a corridor open for days takes more than a flight deck and a few dramatic intercepts. It takes aerial refueling, ordnance flow, maintenance crews, escorts rotating on station, and nearby airfields able to receive transports like the C-17, which can carry up to 170,900 pounds of cargo, or 102 troops, and operate from runways of about 3,500 feet when conditions allow. That matters in a fight where one side is trying to exhaust the defender with repeated drone launches, sporadic missile fire, and constant uncertainty rather than a single decisive clash. That logistics picture is why Washington kept adding force depth instead of relying on one symbol in one patch of water. AP reported the movement of at least 1,000 troops from the 82nd Airborne Division, while USP Central Command said its campaign had already struck more than 800 targets and killed hundreds of Houthi fighters and numerous Houthi leaders, a reminder that the US military was not entering this crisis with a clean, empty slate, but with aircraft, ships, crews, and munitions already stretched across a wider regional fight. In that environment, every additional destroyer, every tanker sortie, and every transport load matters because the challenge is not simply reaching the Gulf, but sustaining enough combat power there to defend merchant shipping, deter new launches, and still keep reserve capacity if Iran widens the map. The conflict was now reshaping the battlefield through insurance tables, crew risk, and traffic management, as much as through missiles and aircraft. Bloomberg reported that the cost of war risk coverage for a ship entering Hormuz had jumped to about 5% of vessel value, meaning a $100 million tanker could face roughly $5 million in insurance cost before fuel, crew, and cargo risk were even added. While G-Captain cited London market figures showing about 1,000 vessels, roughly half of them oil and gas tankers, still sitting in Gulf waters with an aggregate hull value above $25 billion. That changes naval planning because a corridor cannot be called open if ships still refuse to move through it. The humanitarian pressure was just as sharp. The International Maritime Organization said, "Seafarers must not be targets," and its council called for international coordination to protect civilian shipping, a sign that the crisis had moved beyond fleet maneuver and into a broader emergency involving crews, insurers, charterers, and governments across 176 member states. At the same time, the insurance market was still offering passage on a single voyage basis, rather than shutting the door completely, with the International Union of Marine Insurance stating that the granting of war cover for the Persian Gulf and Red Sea is and will remain available under specific agreement, which meant the Gulf was not fully closed, but every transit had become a negotiated act of risk. The war was no longer pulling in outside powers only through alliance politics. It was pulling them in through fuel math. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says Hormuz carries 20.9 million barrels per day of oil, roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, while about 1/5 of global LNG trade also moves through that same corridor. Add the reported damage at Ras Laffan, where the Financial Times said the strike knocked out about 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity and could strip around $20 billion a year from revenue, and the crisis stops looking like a Gulf story and starts looking like a direct supply emergency for Asia and Europe. That is why the diplomatic map widened so quickly. In a joint statement carried by Japan's foreign ministry, the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan said they were ready to support reopening the route and declared their readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. That wording matters because 6 governments do not use language like that over a symbolic disruption. They use it when the risk now runs from missile arcs and tanker queues to refinery feedstock, power generation, and industrial output across multiple continents. The battlefield had widened beyond the carrier screen and the shipping corridor. The Washington Post reported that Iran launched fresh missile and drone attacks, not only at Israel, but also at Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Kuwait, while Israeli aircraft answered with strikes on more than 50 sites inside Iran. Once that many capitals and military facilities are inside the strike envelope, the mission changes from escorting tankers to defending an arc of ports, runways, radar sites, and command nodes spread across hundreds of miles of coastline and desert. That is where regional air defense starts carrying the same weight as carrier aviation. Bahrain said a Patriot system intercepted an Iranian drone over Sitra, and Reuters reported that the government described the action as having saved lives after earlier attacks injured 32 civilians, including children. The same Patriot network is fielded across Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. But even a successful intercept tells you how close the threat has moved to population centers, fuel infrastructure, and the bases that would have to support U.S. aircraft, missile defense crews, and logistics aircraft if the fight keeps expanding. What comes next is slower, less cinematic, and in some ways, even harder to manage: mine warfare. AP quoted UK Armed Forces Minister Al Khan's warning that the threat in and around Hormuz includes mines, fast attack boats, ballistic missiles, anti-ship missiles, and drones, which is exactly the mix designed to grind down a reopening effort instead of winning a single clean battle. The Wall Street Journal reported that 10 attack aircraft and Apache helicopters had already joined the fight to hit Iranian boats and drone teams with US planners, fearing that fully restoring control of the waterway could take weeks rather than days. That timeline matters because mine clearance is a specialist mission, not something a carrier strike group can solve by brute force alone. Navy fact files describe the MH-53 Sea Dragon as the service's dedicated AMCM platform, built for mine hunting, mine sweeping, and mine neutralization, while Navy Times reported that 4 Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships forward-based in Bahrain were decommissioned in 2025 and replaced by 3 littoral combat ships carrying the mine countermeasures package. That leaves Washington trying to suppress Iranian launch points, protect surface traffic, and rebuild a mine-clearing screen at the same time, which is why even after more than 120 Iranian vessels were reportedly destroyed, the strait still could not be treated as safely open. The next problem was legitimacy. Warships can escort traffic, helicopters can hunt boats, and mine teams can clear lanes, but reopening a choke point under fire still needs political cover, broad enough that commercial operators believe the route will stay open for more than one convoy cycle. In their joint statement, the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan said, "Freedom of navigation is a fundamental principle of international law," and they called on Iran to stop threats, mine laying, drone attacks, and missile attacks against commercial shipping. That kind of language is not decoration. It is the legal and diplomatic scaffolding required if several navies are going to share patrol sectors, coordinate escorts, and keep merchant traffic moving without every passage turning into a separate national gamble. But even with that backing, the market still showed how fragile the route remained. Seatrade Maritime reported that London marine insurers said 88% of respondents still had appetite to underwrite war risk cover for Hormuz voyages. Yet, The Guardian quoted Lloyd's Market Association Marine Director Neil Roberts describing a huge buildup of risk, a warning that insurance availability and operational confidence are not the same thing. That leaves coalition planners facing a harder endgame than simply sending in more hulls. They have to convince ship owners, charterers, crews, and ports that a passage can be repeated day after day at commercial scale without every transit depending on political improvisation. The final question was no longer whether enough firepower had entered the region. The final question was whether that firepower could be converted into a stable system of access before diplomacy collapsed into a longer maritime standoff. AP reported that Bahrain had taken a draft resolution to the UN Security Council calling for all necessary means to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, while military .com reported that Washington had already stretched its deadline by 5 days after an earlier 8-hour ultimatum. Those two numbers tell the story. The military clock was still running, but the political clock was running out even faster. That is why the deployment of carriers, cruisers, destroyers, stealth aircraft, missile defenses, transports, escorts, and mine-clearing assets does not end the crisis by itself. It only creates the space for a new order to be imposed, whether through convoy protection, UNA-backed enforcement, or a negotiated reopening backed by enough force to make future interference too expensive to repeat. Iran's own message to the UNN and IMO that only non-hostile vessels may pass under Iranian coordination shows how high the stakes have climbed. This is no longer only a fight over one waterway, but a test of who gets to set the rules for one of the world's most important commercial arteries. If you follow military flashpoints, where logistics, sea power, and global pressure collide in real time, subscribe and stay with this channel, because the next move in Hormuz will not just affect the Gulf. It will echo through fuel markets, naval doctrine, and every government now calculating how far this war can spread.